opened his eyes in the darkness of poverty, who turned his tattered workman's shirt into a flag, and then carried that flag to fight for the freedom of a nation and the dignity of labor. This is the life of James Connolly, a man whose tone was fire, whose heart held hope, and whose feet never stopped despite the weight of exhaustion. The narrow lanes of Cowgate in old Edinburgh, damp walls, leaking roofs, the smell of soup fading into the air, and the restless noise of children playing, on a cold morning of June 5th, 1868, this was the world into which James Connolly was born. His parents, John and Mary Connolly, were Irish immigrants. Migration's burden, labor's hardship, and the struggle for identity filled the air of their home with a permanent unease. Books were scarce in the house, but stories were abundant, tales of poverty, of searching for belonging, and of dreams woven beneath an open sky. Young James quickly understood that in the struggle between survival and dignity, education was often the first casualty. So he stepped directly from childhood into work, odd jobs in factories, errands on the streets. At the age of 14, he enlisted in the British Army, a decision driven by the fire in his stomach and the pressure of a society that offered poor boys nothing but the smell of gunpowder as employment. Military life gave him discipline, but it also let him see up close the machinery of power that built empires on the blood of the poor. He was stationed in various parts of Ireland, particularly in the Kerr camps. There, he began to perceive the deep injustice hidden in Ireland's green fields. The land was Irish, but the boots were British. The hunger was Irish, but the taxes fed an empire. This realization ignited a spark within him, a spark that would later become a blazing flame fueled by ideology and organization. Accounts of his departure from the army differ. Some call it a moral awakening, others a decision of love, still others a collision of fear and poverty. But the result was the same. James left a path where he held a rifle but had no control over his own soul. Back in Edinburgh, he drifted between odd jobs trying to hold himself together. During this period, he met Lily Reynolds, a woman of quiet strength and immense resilience, who saw their partnership not just as a romance, but as a shared responsibility. When they married, they pledged to climb life's steepest hill together. The house was small, children came along, comforts were few, but love endured. Lily provided the kind of steadfast support to James's ideological journey that often remains unseen, but without which no great activist truly stands. It was in these years that James embraced self-education as his weapon. Amid the noise of factories, the press of poverty, and the demands of survival, he sought books, read pamphlets, attended meetings, and debated in workers' clubs. Seeds of socialism began to take root in the soil of his mind. He read Marx and Engels, but also Ireland's own history, its nationalism, and its tradition of social justice, searching for a path that could unite national freedom with the liberation of labor. For him, freedom only had meaning if it appeared as bread on a worker's table. A change in flags or borders meant little if the factory whistle still blew misery into a laborer's life. The 1890s honed his organizational abilities. He worked in socialist circles in Scotland, spoke at workers' rallies, and wrote for labor papers. But his heart was drawn to Ireland, to that place where the nation was in chains, the language retreating, and workers bent double under oppression. In 1896, he arrived in Dublin. There, he founded the Irish Socialist Republican Party, ISRP, a small party but one with a big idea, an Ireland that was not only free but also just, where democracy and workers' rights were inseparable. He launched the Workers' Republic, essays, delivered lectures, and brought his message to corners of society long silenced by power. Connolly's writings possessed clarity and accessibility. He translated complex ideas into everyday language, using metaphors from working-class life. He argued that nationalism divorced from the workers' hunger was nothing but rhetoric, and socialism indifferent to a people's cultural and political subjugation was hollow. For him, Ireland's freedom would only be authentic when the fields belonged to those who tilled them, the factories to those who labored within, and the state to the people who sustained it. By the late 1890s, mounting financial pressures drove Connolly to seek work in America. From 1903 to 1910, these were his international years. New York's tumultuous streets, immigrant neighborhoods, smoke-filled factories, and the fiery halls of union meetings became his classrooms. There he engaged with the Socialist Labor Party and later the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, organizations that sharpened his revolutionary perspective. Against the backdrop of immense corporate power, workers' movements fought back, and Connolly immersed himself in their battles, speaking at rallies, organizing strikes, and learning the craft of propaganda. Through the Irish Socialist Federation, he launched The Harp, a journal linking Irish nationalism with socialism, keeping the Irish struggle alive among the diaspora while rooting it firmly in the global fight for labor rights. These years gave Connolly the practical wisdom that books alone cannot provide, insights born of listening to people's struggles and participating in collective action. He came to understand that organization was not a matter of membership cards, but of discipline, trust, accountability, and constant communication. He also witnessed internal conflicts, party lines, tactical disputes, leadership controversies, but never lost sight of what he considered the essential question: the improvement of working-class life. In his columns, he wrote again and again, "Unity does not arise from suppressing differences, but from a transparent purpose and just principles." In 1910, Connolly returned to Ireland. Dublin and Belfast now pulsed with industrial change. He began working with James Larkin in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, ITGWU, a partnership that would inject new vigor into Ireland's labor movement. Larkin brought boldness and fiery oratory. Connolly brought ideological depth and organizational rigor. The 1913 Dublin lockout was their crucible, a fierce confrontation between labor and capital. Thousands of workers were thrown out of their jobs, unions faced relentless attacks, police batons rained down, and families went hungry. Through it all, Connolly stood with the workers, speaking, organizing, coordinating relief, and above all, inspiring resolve. Out of this struggle came the Irish Citizen Army, ICA, a workers' militia formed to defend strikers from police brutality. This ICA would soon play a decisive role in Ireland's revolutionary struggle. Then came World War I. By 1914, Europe was ablaze with the fever of war. Empires unfurled their flags and sent their young men to die for imperial balances of power. Connolly opposed the war vehemently. To him, it was a slaughterhouse for workers, sons of the poor sent to kill each other for the gain of the rich. He declared that if workers refused to shoot each other, the mighty empires would collapse under their own weight. At this moment, the convergence of nationalism and labor struggle entered a new phase. Whispers of insurrection stirred Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Irish Volunteers, and Connolly's ICA was ready to turn whispers into action. 1916, Easter week. Dublin witnessed a scene that would alter history. In front of the General Post Office, GPO, the Irish flag was raised, a proclamation of independence read aloud, and the echo of a new Ireland rang through the city. James Connolly was among the chief commanders of the Rising, commander of the Dublin Brigade, entrusted with holding the GPO itself. Militarily, the fight was hopelessly uneven. On one side, trained British forces with artillery and machine guns. On the other, volunteers with scant weapons but iron will. Connolly organized barricades, coordinated supplies, and kept morale alive. In one skirmish, he was shot in the ankle, a wound so severe that he could no longer walk. Yet from his bed inside the GPO, he continued issuing orders and encouraging his comrades until the very end. The Rising was crushed within days. When silence returned to Dublin's streets, it was the silence of ruins. Tank tracks imprinted in the cobblestones, bullet holes pocking the walls. Arrests followed, military courts convened, and one by one, the leaders were executed. James Connolly, too injured to stand, was brought to Kilmainham Gaol. On May 12, 1916, they tied him to a chair and shot him. His last words spoke not of hatred but of purpose. He said he fought for the hungry children, the anxious mothers, and for an Ireland whose freedom would not be mere lines on a map, but bread on every table. But death did not end his story. His writings lived on. Labor in Irish History, 1910, and The Reconquest of Ireland, 1915, among them. In these works, he reread Ireland's past through the eyes of labor, showing how centuries of land ownership, feudal exploitation, and foreign domination shaped the lives of ordinary people. He argued that a struggle for freedom without economic justice was only a change of masters. His reasoning was sharp but fair, He attacked systems rather than individuals, respected faith while demanding social responsibility from the state, embraced nationalism while centering workers' rights, and upheld socialist ideals while insisting on democracy and open debate. After Connolly's death, Ireland began to transform. The executions of the rising's leaders shifted public opinion dramatically. What had seemed a foolhardy rebellion became a beacon of martyrdom. Within a few years came the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, the 1937 Constitution, and eventually a sovereign Irish state. Political turbulence, division, and civil war followed, but one truth endured. 1916 became embedded in Ireland's national consciousness, and Connolly stood at its core. His legacy extended into his family, too. His daughter, Nora Connolly O'Brien, became an activist. His son, Roddy Connolly, a prominent socialist and later a founder of the Communist Party of Ireland. Their lives testified that Connolly's home was not just a residence, but a school of commitment, where politics was woven into daily life. Critics of Connolly existed. Some nationalists argued that mixing socialism with the independence struggle complicated matters. Some socialists felt that nationalism distracted from class struggle. Yet Connolly's rejoinder outlasted them. In Ireland, the class question and the national question were two sides of the same coin. A worker cannot be free in a subjugated nation, and a nation cannot be truly free if its workers are shackled. His political strategy was built on this principle, that unity forms not through convenience, but through a shared goal, bread, freedom, and dignity. Connolly's leadership style also leaves lasting lessons. First, he was an idealist. Yes, but also a realist. He knew that ideas turn to lightning only when grounded in organization. That's why he prioritized union building, logistics, and accountability. Second, his politics were marked by moral transparency. He avoided personal gain, submitted himself to public scrutiny, and admitted mistakes. Third, he understood the power of language and culture. He didn't just shout slogans. He told stories, used familiar imagery, and connected with people's lived experience. Fourth, he believed in international solidarity, linking Ireland's struggle with labor movements abroad to give it a global resonance. Today, when Dublin's rusted gates creak open in the wind, one can almost hear footsteps from the past. When pigeons lift off from the roof of the GPO, it feels as though an old dream still flutters there. Connolly's execution chair, once a tool of state violence, has become a symbol, a question carved into history. Do states fear dissent so much they must shackle even the wounded? And a reminder, when the powerless organize, history can be rewritten. In Irish labor strikes today, when workers rally, someone inevitably invokes Connolly's name to remind their comrades that the fight is not just for wages, but for respect. Connolly's thought remains strikingly relevant. In an age of globalization, of powerful corporations and shifting markets, his words feel freshly written, that workers' rights, fair housing, accessible healthcare and education, equitable taxation, and national sovereignty are all interlinked. A state that serves capital over people breeds fracture. A nationalism that exists only as symbols and slogans without improving lives is empty. Connolly teaches us that the honor of a flag cannot be separated from the dignity of those who live under it. He also wrote about the role of women and family, Lily's quiet struggle at the raising of children, and the stories of homes where workers returned each evening exhausted. He argued that politics begins not outside the home, but at its very threshold. For him, reforms in rent laws, working hours, industrial safety, and collective bargaining were not distractions from revolution, but its building blocks. Revolution, he believed, does not descend suddenly from the sky. It is constructed step by step, from union halls to parliamentary chambers. His opponents called him a dreamer. Some labeled him an extremist, but history speaks differently. The man who, bedridden, still mapped out the defense of Dublin, the man who raised a gun not to dominate, but to defend the workers' right to live, he was neither a mere dreamer nor a fanatic. He was a builder, seeking to raise a nation's freedom and a worker's freedom on the same foundation. Even now, when a young activist hands out leaflets, but when a teacher recounts labor history in class, or when a union debates its next step, Connolly's voice echoes. He says, "Shape politics to fit human beings." By this, he did not mean to lower aspirations. He meant to root them in reality so ordinary people could reach them. when neighborhood committees organize, when unions keep their accounts transparent, when political parties open their funding and decisions to public scrutiny. These, for Connolly, were the true seeds of revolution. Sometimes one wonders, had those bullets not ended his life in 1916, what might have been? Perhaps he would have built a Labour Party capable of transforming Ireland's social order. Perhaps he would have forged a durable pact between trade unionism and social democracy. He would likely have faced setbacks and compromises, as all politicians do. But one thing is certain, he would not have betrayed his purpose. Because his purpose was born of his own footsteps in the soil of Cowgate's alleys, Dublin's streets, and the rubble around the GPO. Statues and plaques honoring Connolly are not mere stone and bronze. They are moral yardsticks. When governments pass harsh laws, these monuments ask, will this law weaken the weak further? When markets trample public interest, they whisper, is the state's duty to profit or to people? When identity politics curdles into hatred, they remind, identity is safeguarded by justice, not by prejudice. Connolly's politics contain both peace and resistance, peace with principles, resistance against tyranny. A century after his death, when young Irish men and women imagine their future, they still find guidance in Connolly's words. Our freedom will be complete the day the last worker's home is secure, education is universal, health is assured, and the democratic voice empowered. By that standard, any nation can measure itself, whether Ireland, Britain, America, or anywhere else. In this way, Connolly belongs to the world because the worker's story knows no borders. And yes, there is also a home in this story, Lily's home, where he would enter dragging tired feet, and the children, seeing their father's wounds, would ask, "Daddy, will freedom really come?" He would smile and say, "Not always at once, but as long as we never give up, it will keep knocking at our door." That smile held pain, but also certainty, and it is certainty like this that changes history. Looking at James Connolly's life as a whole, one does not see a straight line, and therein lies its beauty. Sometimes he is the worker outside a factory gate, sometimes the writer hunched over a desk, sometimes the speaker in a union hall, sometimes the wounded commander in battle, sometimes the prisoner in solitary thought, and finally a symbol, a living conscience cast into history. His life teaches us that greatness is built less from resources than from courage, and politics less from slogans than from service. James Connolly's legacy in one line? Perhaps this. He stitched freedom into the worker's cloak, neither so small that it left him naked, nor so heavy that he could not move, just enough to cover his dignity and keep him walking.